Towards the closing years of 18th century, Europe was shaken by the French Revolution, considered by many historians as the most important landmark in human history. The revolution, which occurred at 1789, swept away the existing political institutions and aimed at establishing a more egalitarian society and responsible government than what existed before. The revolution began with the siege of Bastille on the 14th of July 1789 and continued until the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte to power. Let us examine the causes which led to the sudden overthrow of French monarchy in 1789. The first reason is political causes. Royal absolutism, as witnessed during the glorious period of Louis XIV, came to an end with his death in 1715. His great-grandson Louis XV was ascended to the throne at the tender age of 5. Neither had the capacity nor the ability to govern the country effectively. France drifted toward chaos by involving herself in numerous wars, mindless of the financial burden that would fall upon the poor peasantry. She fought the wars of Austrian succession and 7 years of war with the result that she lost her empire. Poor peasants who could not pay the taxes were sent to prison, and those who spoke against royal despotism and tyranny also suffered. King Louis XV never evinced keen interest in governing the country but engaged himself in the pursuit of worldly pleasure. When his minister tried to discuss with him the serious problem of the state, he said, "After me the deluge." Sadly neglected the affairs of the state and appointed his favorites to important offices. The treasury was empty after the wars, and the king remained, as usual, indifferent. He also adopted a policy of repression by imposing curbs on the freedom of the press and speech. The king did little to alleviate the suffering from the common people. The king did little to alleviate the suffering of common people. Louis XV's successor was Louis XVI. He was 20 years old when he came to power. He was intelligent and well intentioned, but he had no will to carry out some bold reforms to set right bad conditions prevailing in France. His judgment was influenced by flattering countries in his ill-advised queen, Marie Antoinette. Unfortunately, France had no uniform code of laws. A law which was regarded as just and fair in one province was not so in another. Nepotism and corruption in every government department further alienated the sympathies of the people. The Bourbon monarchy discarded the practice of consulting the state generals on the state matters. Since the days of Louis XIII, they thought that it served little purpose. In the absence of the state generals, the King of France arrogated powers for themselves, but were advised by able chief ministers like Cardinal Richelieu Mazarin and the France minister like Colbert. However, toward the end of the 18th century, the French monarch was not having such able ministers to guide the destiny of the country. The social causes behind the revolution was invidious distinctions and the unjust privileges marked the character of the French society. The society was divided sharply into three states or classes. The first state was constituted by the higher clergy like archbishops, bishops, and the abbots who governed the Church of France. The first state, the church owned one-fifth of the cultivated land in France and enjoyed great influence with the government. Like the nobles, the higher clergy was also exempt from the paying most of the taxes. With the nobles, they supported absolute monarchy. The church collected tithes, a tax from people for providing community services. It also maintained institution of learning. The lower clergy lived at the in miserable condition. The second state, the nobles. There were about 80,000 families in France who belonged to the nobility. The second state, even though feudalism disappeared in France since the days of Riculli, these families continued to enjoy all the privileges such as non-payment of the most of the taxes, avenues to the higher position in French administration, and income from various feudal dues of the peasants. It may be noted that most of the nobles were absentee landlords. The idle aristocracy became a parasite and made peasants feel that they were paying taxes to them for their luxury. The third state, the common people. The bulk of the French Revolution belonged to the third state. They were the middle class members, the peasants and artisans. The educated middle class, which consisted of merchant, lawyer, teacher, doctor, and others, was conscious of the inequalities in the social order and the unfair and oppressive taxes resorted by the despotic minority. The government hardly cared for their welfare. It was from them that the main thrust for the revolution came. The peasants complained of overburdening taxes which reduced them to penury. After paying taxes to the landlord, the church, and the state, a poor peasant could hardly make both ends meet with the 18% of his income. He was further subjected to humiliation when the nobles destroyed his fields while hunting animals. The French artisans complained of the revolution of trade guilds which favored their masters and left them with the merest income. Then the economic causes. The French system of taxation was both unjust and unfair, despite the fact that peasants in the neighboring countries suffered much more than them. Nevertheless, French peasants suffered due to oppression of the tax farmers and the uncertain imposition of the taxes. The privileged class did not pay the most of the taxes, and the burden was naturally shifted on the shoulders of the poor peasants. There were also intellectual awakening causes. It is said that the ideas govern the world and they come from the philosophers. France produced great philosophers during the 18th century. Voltaire became internationally famous as a great writer and critic whose style and poignant criticism was inimitable. It was through his plays and writing that he launched his bitter attacks against the existing institutions like the church and the state. He made fun of them, of both nobles. Writing about Voltaire, Machiavelli says, of all the intellectual weapons ever wielded by man, the mockery of Voltaire was the most terrible. While Voltaire would have liked enlightened despotism, Montesquieu, a good student of constitutional government, preferred constitutional monarchy in France, such as the English type. He summed up his ideas of such government in his important work De l'Esprit de Louis. It was in this work that he popularized the theory of separation of powers and of its exercise by three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. If this is done, he argued, there would be no tyranny and the liberty of the individual could be safeguarded. Probably the greatest French philosopher of the age was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his social contract, he explained that the king and his subjects are parties to a contract, and therefore, if the king does not rule the people according to their general will, he loses their loyalty. The people have every right to overthrow the monarchy. Jacques was advocating popular sovereignty theory. His writing caused such a spell in on his admirers that they were ready to revolt against the oppressive monarchy. Diderot was another intellectual of the time was prepared by encyclopedia containing the latest knowledge. He exposed the rotten system of administration in France and suggested several remedial measures. The role of the king before the French Revolution was when the American colonists revolted against the oppressive of the mother country and won a resounding victory at the Saratoga, the French government decided to help them with men, money, and materials. It caused by a serious strain on the finance of the country and caused a heavy burden on the poor peasants. After the success of American Revolution 1783, the French volunteers returned to their homeland and sowed the seed of the revolution. The king ought to have reduced the expenses of the royal household and wisely dealt with the financial crisis. However, this was not to because the queen and her advisers always came in his way. Turgot was appointed as the Minister of Finance to suggest remedies. He advised the king to tax the privileged class. He was summarily dismissed at the instance of the queen. The financial crisis reached threatening proportions and the government defaulted payment of salary to the armed forces. Unfortunately, France witnessed near famine condition in 1788 with the result there was serious food shortage. Coupled with this, there was unusual and severe winter in 1789. It was at this critical juncture the king was advised by his courtiers to summon the States General French Parliament to get approval for the federal dose of taxation. Course of revolution was when the States General was summoned, the king ignored the importance of the third state. 600 representatives elected by the common people and tried to consult the representatives of the three states separately. The representatives of the third state advised the king to bring together the representatives of all the three states at one place for discussion of state problems. The king discarded their advice. Subsequently, it led to the quarrel between the king and the representatives of the third state. They, along with a few representatives from the other two states, took a pledge not to return home till the drafting of the new constitution was completed. The new constitution was to be formed to limit the powers of king. When the king dismissed Turgot, rumors spread that he might dissolve the National Assembly also. It was then that the unruly mob in Paris stormed a medieval fortress to Bastille. Standing as a symbol of royal despotism, the Swiss guards were killed and a few political prisoners were set free. The royal power was weakened further when the revolutionaries drove out royalties officials from Paris and established their own government in Paris. The king summoned troops to frighten the Paris mob. It led to the further escalation of mob fury. Hungry women of Paris marched to the royal palace of Versailles and demanded bread. When there was no response, the mob entered the palace and ransacked it. They forced the king, the queen, and the other children to live in the Paris. The National Assembly completed the drafting of the constitution in 1791. According to this new constitution, the king's powers came to be reduced, laws were to be made by the Legislative Assembly, and the members of this assembly were to be elected by tax-paying citizens. The king was not happy at the civil constitution of the clergy. However, he gave his consent to abide by the laws of new constitution. Looking to the tense situation prevailing in the countryside, where the peasant rose in the revolt against the nobles, and also a possibility of a war breaking out with Austria on the borders. The king thought it fit to flee the country. In June 1791, he attempted to flee with his family but was apprehended at the border town of Varennes. Thus ended the hope of moderates who desired a constitutional monarchy. The extremists gained ground in popularity and power. It led to the deposition of the king and his subsequent execution in 1793. France was drifting towards a war with her neighbors as their monarchs were shocked at the execution of the King Louis XVI. A total anarchy prevailed with the new constitution being set aside. The National Convention, which met in September 1792, began to draft a new constitution. It abolished monarchy and declared France as a republic. Then it established a committee of public safety which was headed by the extremist leaders like Danton and Robespierre. These leaders enjoyed unlimited authority. The Girondins, who were moderates, were executed and the reign of terror began. From September 1792 to July 1794, France witnessed the guillotining of thousands of nobles and the innocent men who had supported monarchy. Among the famous women who were executed were Queen Mary and Madame du Barry. Constitution of 1795. After the death of Robespierre, the moderate elements gained predominance in the National Convention. The National Convention framed a new constitution for France in 1795, according to which the executive powers were vested with the directory of 5 persons who were to be advised by a legislative body consisting of two chambers. When there was royalist uprising in Paris against the new constitution, troops were ordered to crush it. A Corsican youth named Napoleon Bonaparte took charge of the command and after a whiff of grape shot dispersed the unruly mob which was about to attack the National Convention. This young officer was destined to rule France from 1799 to 1815. Results of Revolution. During its 10-year course, the French Revolution brought about far-reaching changes. Firstly, it destroyed the vestiges of feudalism and liberated the serfs. Secondly, it established a constitutional monarchy which also disappeared in due course of time. The Declaration of the Rights of Man came to be included in the new constitution as an article of faith. The nobles and the church lost their property and their land were distributed to the peasant. Slaves in Europe colonies were set free. The watchwords of the French Revolution, such as liberty, equality, fraternity, reflected the coming of new democratic and the social order in Europe. Thirdly, the revolution roused national feelings. The common people were prepared to die for the sake of protecting the gains of the revolution. The French citizen militia fought the enemies on the French borders. Finally, the French Revolution had a lasting effect on the people of Europe in 19th century. Those who were groaning under the tyranny of foreign rulers derived their inspiration from the French. Europe was convulsed by frequent revolutions aimed at overthrowing oppressive governments. In the ensuing chapters, one learns about the way in which the Italians and the Germans overthrew the oppressive regime of Austria and achieved unity.